In this section, we're going to talk about creating Azure virtual machines. We're going to do it in a very basic and simple way. Nothing too particular advanced here. So in Azure, if you want to create an Azure virtual machine, the very first thing we actually need to build is we need to build a resource group. Now, a resource group in Azure, you can imagine a little bit like a folder. It doesn't particularly do anything on its own, and it's just used as a container to store resources. Resources might be things like virtual machines, disks, storage accounts, databases, anything that you might want to deploy to Azure. You cannot deploy a virtual machine unless it is deployed inside a resource group. When you create a virtual machine in Azure, it actually creates a number of different components. It creates the virtual machine itself, the compute node. This is where you can actually specify how fast this thing is going to run. So you might want to spec the RAM, the CPU. We'll have a look at some of the different versions of virtual machines that you've got. The virtual machine also comes with a number of other objects. First of all, this virtual machine actually needs to be connected to a VNet. Now, you cannot deploy a virtual machine in Azure unless you deploy a VNet. You also cannot deploy a VNet unless that VNet has got inside it a subnet. Now, on a simple creation of a virtual machine, if you don't have an existing VNet to connect one to, the wizard will create one for you, which you'll see in a moment in the demo. The virtual machine will also have created with it a VNIC, a network card. In Azure, the network card of the virtual machine is a separate object. It's linked to the virtual machine, and the network card can then be linked to the subnet of the VNet. The virtual NIC can actually have multiple IP addresses as well. What we'll also do within our demo environment in a moment is we'll also have a second IP address attached to this VNIC. We will hook in a public IP address so that this thing can communicate to the outside big WBU. Now, this is going to be for remote administration of this virtual machine, and we are going to do that via RDP. Now, this is RDP over port 3389. Do not expose port 3389 to the outside world. I will discuss securing virtual machines correctly later on. This is just a simple demo to get one up and running. This virtual machine will also have attached to it, to run it, a disk, because you need somewhere to actually run your operating system. In fact, there are going to be two partitions created inside that virtual machine on the Windows with a Windows VM. Once we build it, you'll see that again in the demo. So there is also one more component inside here that's needed by this virtual machine, and that's something called an NSG, also known as a network security group. We can imagine this as a little bit like a firewall, in the sense that a network security group can be attached to a NIC, or it can be attached directly to a subnet inside a VNet. And what a network security group is going to do is basically just block ports. Okay, it doesn't do anything particularly fancy. It blocks/allows ports. It is not a firewall. You can imagine this like it's putting a big barrier around that virtual machine that basically says the only thing that's coming through this barrier are the ports that I actually okay and recommend. So this is all going to be constructed in a simple and basic way by using an Azure wizard. Now, we can deploy virtual machines in a few different ways inside Azure with ARM templates, with Terraform, with Bicep, and all that fun infrastructure as code stuff, but we're just going to keep this as simple as possible. We could also deploy each of these components in their separate wizards, but we're just going to deploy one virtual machine. So again, we're going to keep it simple, stupid. Okay, so let's move on to our demo for how to actually go and build one of these virtual machines. Now, this is an MSDN account. It's a test account. It is restricted in some certain ways. but for the purposes of this demo, it should be perfectly fine. So let's go and create, first of all, a resource group for my environment and for this demo. We'll do this as YouTube VM demo. Okay, just give it a name. Now this YouTube VM demo, I'm going to make sure it goes into a resource location of UK South. Interestingly enough, this resource location here does not actually need to line up with the resources that are inside it. It's really more of a label than anything else. I'm not going to bother tagging this resource group either. We'll cover tags later on, and we'll just go and create that resource group. Once that's built, I can go to it, and this is going to be a location where I can store, in this case, a single virtual machine. So let's go create a virtual machine. First things first, in Azure, if you cannot find something, use the search bar. This lovely little search bar up here does actually work, unlike the search in Windows 10. I don't know how Microsoft managed to break that so badly. Anyway, let's come into virtual machines. When we go and create a virtual machine down here, there's a few options. We'll cover Azure Arc virtual machines and Azure VMware Solution virtual machines later on. First of all, we're just going to select a basic Azure VM. Now, within this basic Azure virtual machine wizard, we can select where we want to deploy it. We'll deploy it to this YouTube VM demo, and we will call it YouTube VM demo. Very, very quick, very, very simple. This is going to be deployed to a region of UK South. Now, interestingly, when it comes to regions like this, certain regions will only actually allow certain sizes of virtual machines. You can get into a situation where your size of virtual machine is not actually available on your chosen region. We're going to change the image. We're not going to run through all of these options at the moment, but we're going to get out of Ubuntu here, and we're going to choose something really basic. We're going to actually just choose a Windows Server 2019 data center here, so we have a nice GUI to work with. Now, admittedly, I could choose anything I wanted to down here. If you go to see all images, for example, there is not just basic images for things like Windows Server and Windows 11, but there's images for, well, everything under the sun. There's 89 pages of images down here if you really want them. If you can think of an OS, it's probably available in here. Or more to the point, if you can think of a modern OS, it's probably in there. You're not going to find Windows 98, let's be honest. So, architecture, 64-bit. ARM is not supported with this image, even though we can start to deploy ARM now, relatively useful. So the sizing structure down here. Unlike some clouds in Azure, you cannot actually choose the amount of cores and the amount of RAM for a virtual machine. You actually have to choose a preset size. Some of these are cheaper than others. Some of these are exceedingly expensive. Okay. For example, if you come down here and start to have a look at things like this E-series down here, and you start to have a look at these memory optimized machines with 20 cores and 160 gigs worth of RAM, it starts to get very, very expensive very quickly. Be very careful in Azure, because you don't actually see the costings down here when you're selecting the virtual machine. You need to go and have a look for the Azure pricing calculator. And if you go to that Azure pricing calculator here, you can now start to choose your virtual machines and choose the costing for them. It's got a SQL database on it. So choose virtual machines, and you can see how much this is actually going to cost you. Okay, this is on pay-as-you-go with license included. I'll cover some extra things about costings later. At the moment, I'm choosing a relatively basic machine, 2 vCPUs, 8 gigs worth of RAM. That's fine. Just a top tip here, if you choose a single core with Windows Server, it will work, but it will be very, very, very slow. Okay, so let's go and choose a basic password for me. This is a local password that's going to be injected into the machine. Now this section down here for inbound port rules, this is actually quite important, because here this is actually an NSG configuration, the network security group configuration. It doesn't say it down there, but it is. So when I'm allowing ports here, like port RDP through, this is essentially allowing a rule through the network security group. Final piece of the puzzle here is licensing. I'm confirming that I already have a Windows Server license, and this will save me a huge chunk of cash when I'm just using this for demos and for examples. So the disks, this is the virtual machine's hard drive. The virtual machine's hard drive, go faster, it'll cost you more money. There is actually something called an ultra disk as well, and an ultra disk is only supported on certain locations. It's not supported on every data center yet. So you can also attach new disks if you wish. The amount of disks you can attach to a virtual machine depends on the size of the virtual machine itself. Now inside the networking tab, because this resource group has no virtual networks available, and there are no virtual networks within my current account here, or my current subscription, what it's going to do is it's going to create me a brand new virtual network with a brand new subnet and a brand new public IP address attached to this. Okay, this is going to be perfectly fine at the moment. I could adjust this if I wanted to with create new. I could build my own virtual network, but I'm just going to leave it with the standard subnet and the standard IP range that it gives me here. Okay, not going to do anything special. So going back to management on here, inside management, take note of what I've got set up. Auto shutdown, this is actually going to turn off at 7 p.m. This is useful if you have a certain amount of credit and you're playing with demos all the time, so it will just turn that machine off. Remember, you are charged per minute while this virtual machine is up and running. If the virtual machine is turned off, you are actually only charged for the storage of the disks, which is very, very cheap. So if you're doing this for demos and your machines don't need to be up 24/7, make sure to turn them off. I'm not going to enable boot diagnostics. We'll cover that at a later date. I'm not going to enable any extensions. All we are doing is we are creating an extremely basic VM. So I have literally taken a standard DS2 v3 machine here with Windows Server 2019. It's validation passed, so everything seems to be working at the moment, and it's going to create a brand new virtual network for me. So let's go and create this virtual machine, and it shouldn't take all that long to actually build. It depends on the size of the virtual machine. Some big virtual machines take an exceedingly long time to build. But while we're seeing this deployment in progress down here, you'll notice that this is also listed up here within the notifications area, and this will go into the Azure logs. As you can see, through the deployment itself, it's not just saying I'm deploying a virtual machine, it's actually telling you that it is deploying multiple things. It's deployed the public IP, it's deployed a network security group, a virtual network, a NIC, and it's also now deployed the virtual machine itself. So it really didn't take all that long. So we can now go to that virtual machine, go to that resource itself, and we can see the VM. If we drop out of this slightly and come back to the resource groups and go to the resource group that we deployed, you'll actually see the virtual machine and its associated components as well. The disk, the NIC, the virtual network, the network security group, the IP address or the public IP address, and the actual virtual machine itself. So let's go into the virtual machine. And within that virtual machine, we can choose to immediately connect to this. This virtual machine has got a public IP address exposed to the internet. Secondly, this virtual machine is attached to this network security group. And if you remember, during the deployment, in that network security group options, we have port 3389 set to allow. So if we go back to the virtual machine itself, we can connect and connect via RDP. This will download an RDP file to my machine. And if we open that up, we can connect, and we can connect with the account that I actually used upon creation of the VM. We now have an RDP connection to that virtual machine. Give that a moment. There we go. And you can do anything you want with this VM. This VM is connected to the internet. We open up Edge. It is a fully cloud-hosted virtual machine that I am paying for per minute. I don't want to sync my data, but I just want to prove a slight point here with the speeds of these VMs. Now, a virtual machine running over the internet, the first question that a lot of people will ask is how fast is that internet connection that's actually attached to this virtual machine? Because if I'm sending data and receiving data from this, I want to know that it isn't throttled at all. Do a very quick test here on speedtest.net, and as you can see, it's quite a quick connection. Now you can actually get faster than that. You can get a lot faster than that, in fact, but it depends actually on the virtual machine itself, the virtual machine specification. What's holding this back here is not the networking in Azure, but what's holding this back here is actually the processing power of that VM. You spin up a faster VM, you'll get a faster internet connection. So if I close down this RDP connection here, and if I just drop back into the overview of my virtual machine and stop that virtual machine so I don't actually get charged a lot of money for running it. Remember, when you stop a virtual machine, you are literally turning it off. You do not lose the data, the disks are still available to you underneath. And that's how you create an Azure virtual machine in an Azure wizard with the logic of keep it simple, stupid.